April 5, 1945, Gothic Line, northern Italy. German observers along the fortified mountain positions watched American units begin their approach. Wehrmacht intelligence had identified them as elements of the 92nd Infantry Division, a segregated black unit. German commanders received the reports and dismissed the threat. Their defensive doctrine assumed black American troops lacked the capability for coordinated mountain assault. Units prepared for what they expected would be a contained engagement. The next 72 hours would force German high command to abandon their entire defensive strategy in northern Italy. What the 92nd Division did next violated every assumption both armies had made about race and warfare. Stories that overturn assumptions this fundamental deserve examination. If you want accounts that challenge what you thought you knew about military history, stay with Battlefront Insider. By spring 1945, Allied forces in Italy faced the Gothic Line. This defensive barrier stretched 200 miles across the northern Apennines. Germany had fortified it for 18 months. Previous Allied assaults had failed with massive casualties. The barrier represented Germany's last major defensive position in Italy. Breaking it would open the route to the Po Valley and force German withdrawal from the entire Italian peninsula. The 92nd Infantry Division arrived in theater as a segregated unit under white command structure. United States military policy mandated racial segregation despite battlefield requirements. The division faced skepticism from Allied command. Some American units demonstrated open hostility. The military's racial doctrine created a contradiction. The nation fought fascism abroad while enforcing racial hierarchy at home. German propaganda had spent years specifically targeting black soldiers. Wehrmacht officers circulated intelligence assessments suggesting black troops lacked combat effectiveness. This belief became incorporated into tactical doctrine. German units assigned to sectors facing the 92nd Division received lower priority for reinforcements and supplies. Gothic Line commanders viewed their section as a quiet sector specifically because black troops opposed them. The racism wasn't just prejudice. It became operational planning assumption. The strategic situation demanded breakthrough before German forces could retreat and regroup. Allied command assigned the 92nd Division the mission to take Mount Fragoline and adjacent high ground. The terrain favored defense absolutely. Approaches were exposed. Fields of fire interlocked. Positions had been prepared and reinforced. Previous units had attempted the same objective and suffered 60% casualties. The German 148th Infantry Division held the position with veteran troops. They possessed confidence born from successful defense and reinforced by racial assumptions. Their intelligence reports confirmed what their propaganda had taught them. Black American soldiers would not present serious tactical challenge. Both German command and elements of Allied leadership expected the 92nd Division to fail. This created perfect conditions for tactical surprise, but only if the division could overcome obstacles that existed before the first shot was fired. The Gothic Line itself was formidable. The assumptions surrounding who would attack it proved equally significant. German forces prepared to defend against an enemy they had underestimated. The 92nd Division prepared to attack under a command structure that had already written them off as ineffective. The operation would test more than military capability. It would test whether institutional racism could survive contact with battlefield reality. The 92nd Division faced obstacles before firing a shot. Supply chain dysfunction manifested immediately. Ammunition shipments arrived delayed. Equipment requests were denied or deprioritized. The pattern suggested systematic rather than coincidental failure. White officers within the divisional command structure refused to advocate for their own units. Some requested transfers rather than lead black soldiers into combat. This created leadership instability at the exact moment stability mattered most. When officers view their assignment as punishment rather than command, soldiers suffer the consequences. Intelligence reports from higher command consistently underestimated German strength in the 92nd sector. The division requested reconnaissance missions. Requests were denied and labeled unnecessary for a low-priority sector. When the division requested artillery support, fire missions were allocated to other units first. A pattern emerged across all logistical categories. The 92nd Division received what other divisions rejected or deemed surplus. Training time was cut short due to urgent need at the front. Then units were held in reserve for weeks. The contradiction was obvious to everyone involved. The urgency that justified abbreviated training disappeared when actual deployment decisions were made. The morale issue compounded daily. Soldiers knew they were being set up for failure. They read the same racist propaganda Germans used, except it was published in American newspapers and distributed through official military channels. Letters from home described riots, lynchings, and discrimination their families faced. The question became existential rather than tactical. Why fight for a country that denied your humanity? German intelligence reports confirmed their bias. Captured documents showed Wehrmacht planners expected minimal resistance from the 92nd Division's sector. German defensive plans allocated the best troops elsewhere. They assumed the 92nd sector required only a holding force. This created a paradox. German underestimation created opportunity, but only if the 92nd could overcome internal sabotage from its own command structure. Division staff officers, mostly black men working under white commanders, began unauthorized planning. They knew the official plans were inadequate and potentially suicidal. But proposing alternatives required challenging white superior officers. In a segregated military, this carried severe consequences beyond battlefield failure. Several black officers submitted detailed tactical proposals through proper channels. The reports disappeared into bureaucracy or were returned with dismissive notes. No substantive engagement with the tactical content occurred. The message was clear. Black officers were not expected to contribute to operational planning. The problem crystallized into an impossible situation. The 92nd Division possessed combat capability. Soldiers were trained. Officers understood tactics and terrain. But the division operated within a system designed to ensure their failure. White commanders who should have advocated for their units instead undermined them. Supply systems that should have supported operations instead deprioritized them. Intelligence that should have informed planning instead dismissed their sector as insignificant. The officers faced a choice. Follow orders they knew would result in failure and massive casualties. Or risk court-martial by developing and implementing alternative plans without authorization. The choice was between certain death under incompetent orders and possible death under competent but unauthorized ones. Military law was clear about insubordination. But so was the mathematics of following orders designed by people who wanted them to fail. The division had less than 2 weeks to decide which risk to accept. Early combat operations revealed a deadly pattern. February 1945 brought the division's first major test. The 370th Regiment received orders to take Castello Agonalfi. White officers unfamiliar with the terrain prepared the attack plan. No adequate reconnaissance was conducted. Artillery support was insufficient. The timeline was unrealistic. The regiment advanced into prepared German positions at a severe disadvantage. German machine gun nests were positioned exactly where intelligence reports said they would not be. Companies suffered 40% casualties in the first 6 hours. Survivors were forced to withdraw. Wounded men remained exposed to German counterfire. Medics attempting rescue became casualties themselves. After-action reports from White Command blamed lack of aggressive spirit among black troops. The reports made no mention of intelligence failure. They omitted inadequate support. They ignored flawed planning. The pattern established itself immediately. Each failure would be blamed on racial characteristics rather than systematic failures in command and logistics. The pattern repeated across the division's operational area. Staff Sergeant James Williams died from friendly artillery fire. A white artillery officer unfamiliar with the unit submitted incorrect fire mission coordinates. Williams was a decorated veteran. The error that killed him was preventable and resulted from the same command dysfunction that plagued the entire division. Second Lieutenant Robert Brooks died leading his platoon forward after his white company commander refused to advance. Brooks received a posthumous Silver Star. The citation made no mention of the circumstances that forced a junior officer to assume command responsibility his superior had abandoned. Private First Class Eugene Ashley was wounded 3 times while evacuating casualties after white officers abandoned their position. Ashley survived but lost his leg. He received no formal recognition for his actions. The official record treated his wounds as routine combat casualties rather than the result of extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. These were not abstract statistics. Each represented a family destroyed. Each represented potential eliminated. Each represented injustice compounded by official denial. Families received casualty notifications but not the truth about circumstances. Official reports maintained the fiction that casualties resulted from combat inadequacy rather than command failure. Home front newspapers printed stories suggesting black soldiers died because they lacked courage or discipline. This reached the troops through mail call. They were dying while being told they were cowards. They were performing acts of extraordinary valor while being officially characterized as deficient. Unit cohesion should have collapsed under these conditions. Instead, the opposite occurred. Shared injustice created determination that transcended normal military motivation. Soldiers began making a pact among themselves. If they were going to die anyway, it would be while proving something. Not to white commanders who had already decided they were inferior. Not to German enemies who shared that assessment. To themselves, their families, and their communities. An informal leadership network developed among black NCOs and junior officers. They began quietly coordinating across companies and battalions. They shared intelligence their white commanders ignored. They planned contingencies their official orders did not include. They created a parallel command structure within the official hierarchy. This was technically insubordination. It could result in courts-martial or execution. But the death rate under the current system made court-martial seem like an acceptable risk. Death was already the probable outcome. The question was whether it would accomplish anything. By late March 1945, the division had suffered over 2,000 casualties. The replacement system struggled because white commanders did not want assignment to black units. New arrivals were often undertrained or considered unsuitable for assignment to white units. Yet these same replacements had to immediately integrate into units facing active combat operations. The psychological toll accumulated relentlessly. Soldiers watched friends die and then watched the system blame them for dying. Some broke under the pressure. Mental health casualties increased. But the military did not recognize combat stress in black soldiers the same way it did in white soldiers. Diagnosis often became lack of discipline rather than trauma requiring treatment. Stories like this one exist because people refuse to let systemic failure erase individual courage. If these accounts matter to you, Battlefront Insider preserves them. April approached with the division battered, undersupplied, and officially considered unreliable. The Gothic line offensive was scheduled. The 92nd Division received objectives everyone expected them to fail to achieve. The difference was that this time, the soldiers themselves had decided the official expectations were irrelevant. What happened next would be shaped not by the officers who had failed them, but by the soldiers who refused to accept failure as inevitable. Late March 1945 brought the official operation order for the Gothic line assault. Black staff officers reviewed the plan during a routine briefing. The plan repeated every mistake that had caused previous failures. Reconnaissance remained inadequate. The timeline was unrealistic. Support was insufficient. Officers exchanged glances during the briefing but said nothing. Insubordination in front of white commanders was too risky. After the white commanders left, an informal meeting convened. Captain John Runyon, the operations officer, spread maps his white superior had ignored during the official briefing. Runyon had been conducting unauthorized reconnaissance for weeks. He had used contacts with Italian partisans to gather intelligence that official channels had missed. German positions were different than official maps showed. They were stronger in some areas and weaker in others. Partisan reports indicated potential infiltration routes the official plan completely ignored. Staff Sergeant Edward Carter proposed an alternative approach. Carter was a veteran of the Spanish Civil War. He understood mountain warfare better than most officers in the division, white or black. His tactical knowledge exceeded that of the white officers who dismissed his suggestions. Now, speaking only to black officers and NCOs, he outlined a different strategy. First Lieutenant Vernon Baker added intelligence from his own reconnaissance patrols. Baker had been leading night patrols without authorization for weeks. He had been mapping German positions. He had identified weaknesses in the German line that official intelligence had missed or ignored. Together, the group developed an alternative operational plan. The plan used terrain differently. It timed movements to exploit German shift changes and known patterns in their defensive routine. It coordinated with partisan intelligence that official channels had never bothered to collect. The plan was tactically superior to the official orders in every measurable way. The problem was that implementing it required ignoring direct orders from white command. The dilemma crystallized in the silence around the map table. They could follow orders they knew would result in massacre. Or they could develop a parallel plan and somehow execute it without official approval. The legal situation was absolutely clear. What they were discussing constituted mutiny. In wartime, mutiny carried the death penalty. But continuing to follow orders that would get soldiers killed for reasons of racial prejudice was its own form of murder. Lieutenant Baker articulated what everyone in the room knew. They were facing death either way. The only question was whether they would die proving their detractors right or proving them wrong. The decision formed through unspoken consensus. They would prepare to execute their own plan while officially appearing to follow orders. This required elaborate deception. They needed to appear to follow the white commander's plan while actually implementing their own. This required coordination across the entire division without white officers noticing. Black NCOs would brief their squads on the real plan. White company commanders would receive reports suggesting the official plan was being followed. Radio communications would be coded to sound compliant while actually directing alternative operations. The risk was enormous. If discovered before the attack, the entire leadership faced courts-martial and possible execution. If the plan failed during the attack, they would have given white commanders perfect evidence to blame black soldiers for the failure. Success was the only outcome that justified this level of insubordination. Yet success seemed improbable given their resource limitations and German defensive strength. Captain Runyon took an unofficial vote. Every officer and senior NCO present agreed to participate. They did not agree because they were confident in success. They agreed because dying while trying something intelligent seemed preferable to dying while following orders they knew were stupid. They spent the next week operating in two parallel realities. The official reality involved dutiful compliance with the flawed operational plan. The actual reality involved detailed coordination of their alternative approach. White commanders noticed nothing. They were not looking for tactical sophistication from black officers. This racist assumption became the division's operational advantage. The soldiers prepared knowing they were betting everything on a single operation. Failure meant death and posthumous disgrace. Success meant proving something that should not have required proof. But the system had left them no other option. As the attack date approached, the tension became unbearable. They had committed to a path with no retreat. Either they would break through the Gothic line and validate their defiance, or they would die and history would remember them as a failed experiment in racial integration. On April 4, 1945, they received final orders to attack at dawn. Nobody except the soldiers themselves knew they planned to do something completely different. The night of April 4 to 5, 1945, the parallel command structure activated. Black NCOs conducted squad briefings after white officers completed their official briefings. Real objectives were communicated through careful verbal instructions. No written orders existed that could be discovered. Soldiers were instructed to acknowledge white officers' commands, then follow different instructions from their sergeants. Captain Runyon coordinated with the Italian partisan liaison. Partisans would guide lead elements through infiltration routes the official plan ignored. This coordination happened through personal relationships, not official channels. The white intelligence officers had never bothered to establish these relationships. Lieutenant Baker positioned his company for night movement toward the German weak point his reconnaissance had identified. Movement began hours before the official H hour. The white battalion commander was told this was prepositioning for the morning attack. Actually, Baker's company was infiltrating German lines under darkness. They advanced in small teams. They avoided German listening posts that official intelligence had claimed did not exist. By 0300 hours, elements of the 92nd Division were inside the German defensive perimeter. German sentries expected no night movement. Black soldiers supposedly lacked the capability for night combat operations. This racist assumption proved fatal. Baker's teams eliminated observation posts without firing shots. German officers sleeping in their command bunker remained unaware their forward positions were compromised. Meanwhile, supporting units moved to positions for the actual assault rather than the official one. Artillery forward observers established posts based on actual German positions, not the map coordinates in the official plan. White artillery officers received fire mission requests that matched the official plan. But black forward observers had positioned themselves for the actual attack. At 0530 hours, the official H hour arrived. Artillery began firing. White commanders believed the bombardment followed the official plan. The shells were landing where black officers had directed them, on actual German positions rather than coordinates from outdated maps. German defenders woke to artillery impacting with unexpected accuracy. Confusion compounded as they realized American infantry was already inside their perimeter. By the time the official attack began, the 92nd Division had already achieved tactical surprise. German company commanders tried to organize response, but their communications were disrupted. Forward observers eliminated during the night infiltration could not report American positions. Command posts received contradictory information. Wehrmacht doctrine assumed black American troops could not execute complex night operations. Their entire defensive plan was built on this assumption. The assumption was proving catastrophically wrong. At 0600 hours, the German 148th Division commander realized he was fighting a completely different battle than his intelligence had predicted. His defensive positions were already compromised. German defenders recovered from initial surprise. Wehrmacht units were experienced and well-trained. They still outnumbered American forces in the sector. German artillery began counter-battery fire. Several American positions took heavy casualties. A White Company commander panicked. He radioed for permission to withdraw. Captain Runyon had to make a split-second decision. Official authority said retreat. The actual plan required continuing the advance. Runyon countermanded the withdrawal order using a seniority technicality. This was explicit insubordination, but there was no time for debate. Lieutenant Baker's company reached the Mount Fragile summit. German defenders counterattacked with their reserve platoon. Hand-to-hand combat occurred on the mountain peak. Baker's men held position despite being outnumbered. The German battalion commander committed his reserve company to retake the summit. This was exactly what the black officers had predicted and planned for. The moment German reserves committed to the counterattack, American artillery struck their assembly area. The fire mission was coordinated by forward observers the Germans did not know existed. The German counterattack collapsed before reaching the summit. But the situation remained critical. The 92nd Division had penetrated the Gothic line but had not broken through completely. German forces could still contain the breakthrough if they reacted quickly. The next 2 hours would determine whether tactical success became operational victory or whether German reserves would arrive and trap the 92nd Division in an exposed salient. Everything depended on the exploitation phase that nobody had officially planned. White commanders still did not realize an alternative plan was being executed. They were trying to direct the battle according to official orders while black officers were fighting an entirely different battle. Leadership under these conditions requires more than tactical skill. Understanding that matters deserves recognition. Battlefront Insider documents it. Communication broke down between the official and actual command structures. This created a moment of maximum confusion and vulnerability. For 3 hours, 2 separate American command structures tried to fight the same battle with completely different plans. The battle's outcome hung on which structure the German forces would encounter. By 1000 hours, the 92nd Division had captured key terrain on the Gothic line. Adjacent Allied units noticed German forces repositioning. Wehrmacht units were pulling reserves from other sectors to contain the 92nd Division breakthrough. This weakened the German line elsewhere. The British 8th Army commander received reports about the 92nd Division's progress. The reports contradicted his expectations. He had assumed their attack would fail. Reconnaissance confirmed the 92nd actually held Mount Fragile and was advancing beyond it. Allied High Command realized an opportunity existed. They ordered supporting attacks along the entire Gothic line. These attacks succeeded because German reserves were already committed against the 92nd Division. The German Army Group C commander faced a cascading crisis. Every sector reported American or British pressure. His mobile reserves, which should have been available for counterattack, were already committed. All of them were committed against the unit he had been told would pose minimal threat. By 1400 hours, the Gothic line was crumbling across multiple sectors. German commanders began ordering retreat from positions they had held for 18 months. This was not a local tactical withdrawal. This was operational collapse. Wehrmacht intelligence officers scrambled to understand how they had misread the 92nd Division so catastrophically. Their entire defensive plan had been built on the assumption that black American troops could not execute coordinated assault. That assumption had cost them their primary defensive line in Italy. Captured German officers later reported widespread confusion. They had genuinely believed their own propaganda about racial military capability. Meeting an American unit that operated with tactical sophistication shattered their doctrinal assumptions. More importantly, the success of the 92nd Division forced Allied command to reconsider their own assumptions. If black soldiers could break the Gothic line, what else were segregated policies preventing? When one action exposes systemic failures across multiple institutions, the implications extend beyond immediate results. That expansion matters. Battlefront Insider tracks it. Within 24 hours, what began as one division's unauthorized tactical modification had fractured the entire German defensive strategy in Italy and started forcing questions about American military policy itself. German Army Group C issued an emergency situation report on April 6, 1945. The report detailed the Gothic line breach and attributed it specifically to the 92nd Infantry Division. Wehrmacht Intelligence Directorate was ordered to explain how they had misjudged the unit so completely. Analysis revealed German intelligence had relied on American racial propaganda. They had assumed American assessments of black soldier capability were militarily accurate. They had never questioned whether American racial prejudice might distort military evaluation. German commanders realized they had let ideology override tactical judgment. This proved costly. Their entire defensive strategy had been based on a flawed assumption. Other German units now faced a different problem. They were receiving orders based on old intelligence that suggested American units posed varying levels of threat. But if intelligence about the 92nd Division was wrong, what else was wrong? Trust in Wehrmacht intelligence evaluation broke down at a critical moment. Meanwhile, the American command structure experienced its own crisis. Allied High Command demanded an explanation for the 92nd Division's success. White officers who had predicted failure now had to explain why they were wrong. Some attempted to credit white leadership within the division. But after-action reports made clear the tactical initiative had come from black officers and NCOs. Several white commanders who had filed negative reports about black soldiers were now exposed. Their reports were contradicted by objective battlefield results. This created a political problem for U.S. military leadership. Segregation policy was predicated on the assumption that black soldiers required white leadership. Yet the Gothic Line operation had succeeded when black leaders operated autonomously. Several senior black officers quietly filed reports documenting what had actually happened. The reports detailed how they had implemented an alternative plan without white commanders' knowledge or approval. These reports were politically explosive. They proved black officers possessed tactical competence equal to white officers. They also proved that some white officers' incompetence had nearly caused preventable casualties. Army bureaucracy did not know how to handle these reports. Publishing them would validate black officers' tactical judgment. But it would also expose systematic racism within the command structure. The reports were classified and buried. However, word spread through informal networks. Black soldiers throughout the European theater heard about the Gothic Line. They learned their own officers had planned and executed a successful operation despite the white command structure. This knowledge changed everything. Soldiers who had believed the system might be right about racial limitations now knew better. They had seen proof that black leadership could succeed at the highest tactical levels. White officers who had held racist assumptions now faced cognitive dissonance. Some doubled down, insisting the Gothic Line was an anomaly or luck. Others privately acknowledged they had underestimated black soldiers. Few publicly advocated for policy change. Careers depended on maintaining the existing system. By late April 1945, multiple competing narratives existed about the same operation. The official version credited divisional leadership without specifying racial dynamics. German analysis treated it as an intelligence failure. Black soldiers knew it as proof of capability. White supremacists dismissed it as an exception. The reality remained classified in after-action reports that nobody outside the military would see for decades. The Gothic Line breakthrough continued. The 92nd Division advanced beyond German secondary positions. But the conversation about what the breakthrough meant became more important than the tactical gains. A single operation had created evidence that challenged the entire racist military system. The system's response was to acknowledge the success while avoiding its implications. The 92nd Division would continue fighting through the end of the war, but the real battle over what their success meant had just begun. The war ended in May 1945. The 92nd Infantry Division received recognition for the Gothic Line breakthrough. A Presidential Unit Citation was awarded for actions between April 5 and April 8, 1945. Individual soldiers received decorations including Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and Purple Hearts. Lieutenant Vernon Baker eventually received the Medal of Honor, but not until 1997. 52 years passed between the action and the recognition. Captain John Runyon returned to segregated America. He worked as a postal clerk in Georgia. He never spoke publicly about the tactical planning that broke the Gothic Line. Staff Sergeant Edward Carter received the Distinguished Service Cross. His recommendation for the Medal of Honor was rejected by white reviewing officers. The award was not upgraded until 1997. Soldiers who survived the Gothic Line returned to a country still enforcing segregation. Many faced violence from white Americans who were threatened by black military competence. Some were killed while in uniform by racist mobs. Their service did not protect them from the racism they had fought against. Military desegregation did not occur until 1948, 3 years after the Gothic Line. Even then, implementation took years and faced resistance. Gothic Line veterans watched younger black soldiers serve in integrated units. They knew their own sacrifice had helped make that possible. But they also knew they never received the recognition they deserved when it mattered. History would eventually acknowledge what happened on the Gothic Line, but for the men who made it happen, that acknowledgement came too late or not at all. The Gothic Line operation reveals three interconnected truths. First, capability exists independent of recognition. The 92nd Division possessed tactical competence whether white commanders acknowledged it or not. Their skill did not require validation. It required opportunity. Second, systematic prejudice creates military vulnerability. German forces lost the Gothic Line because ideology distorted their intelligence. American forces nearly failed to use an effective unit because ideology distorted their judgment. Racism proved to be a strategic liability for both sides. Third, proving capability under an unjust system does not automatically eliminate injustice. Gothic Line veterans demonstrated everything white supremacists claimed black soldiers could not do. Yet they returned to a segregated society that continued denying their humanity. Proof of competence is not sufficient to overcome systematic discrimination. Change requires political will, not just evidence. The broader implication extends beyond race and military history. Talent exists everywhere. What varies is opportunity and recognition. The historical record is full of absent victories, battles that could have been won by people who were never allowed to lead. The Gothic Line stands as an exception that proves the rule. Excellence can emerge despite oppression. But it should not have to. The question is not whether capable people exist in marginalized groups. The Gothic Line answered that. The question is how many more victories were lost because those people never received the chance. The Gothic Line represents thousands of untold stories from military history. Stories of capability demonstrated despite systematic denial of opportunity. Stories that challenge comfortable narratives about who possessed competence and courage. These accounts exist in classified reports, forgotten after-action summaries, and fading memories. They deserve preservation and examination, not to create new heroes, but to accurately understand how military victories actually occur. Understanding requires confronting uncomfortable truths about systematic prejudice. It also requires recognizing human excellence wherever it manifests. If this account challenged your assumptions or revealed something you did not know, subscribe to Battlefront Insider for more stories that do the same. This is Battlefront Insider, where we reveal the human stories behind every war.